Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm going to begin this presentation. I hope you all can hear me well. I am at Washington and Lee and beaming to all of your different locations throughout the Commonwealth. Students come to your class to learn how to communicate in a new and different language. So how can we be sure that we're getting them there? Have you all received a handout? Perfect. I will be going over the objectives. Oh, you're all. Thank you for responding. These are the objectives for our 2 hours together today. The first is you will be able to identify the standard skills and modes involved in proficiency-based teaching and learning. You will compare and analyze grading schemes. You'll reflect on your own grading practices, and then you will devise a new grading system so that when you leave today, you will have in place a new system of grading that will lead your students toward a growth of proficiency and also better communicate with stakeholders about that growth toward proficiency. I'll also provide you with a copy of some proposed grading parameters that are proficiency-based. One which is for modern languages and another which is for classical languages. Here's our little pre-assess. I hope you are all familiar with the graphic on the left. What does it represent? And I am following all your responses as the facilitators mark them. Okay, Ms. Garcia, thanks. They're the 5 C's. Those are our national standards. And for those of you who are visual learners, like myself, you can see that not any one of these standards is more important than the others. Thank you, Bedford. They're all interconnected. And our Virginia SOLs are linked directly to our national standards. So you'll see here, matching the color for communication, we have the Virginia standards of learning. And there are several of them. Can you tell me what they represent in terms of skills? Now you all have the handout. And so you see here, this is like a Cornell Notes where you write words or visuals that help you remember the things we're learning about. And it says standards here. So we have our national standards and our state standards. So if you didn't realize before that they were the 5 C's and the standards of learning, you can mark them there so that you can take this home and refer to it. But the skills, what do we see here? I see some skills there like listening. How many skills are there? I see people tapping away. Listening, reading, writing. Thank you, Longwood. Yes. There's one more. Speaking. Thank you, ODU. So we have all those different skills, and they're encompassed within the Virginia SOLs, and they are derived from the communication standard, the national standard. So I've noted on your handout that there are 4 skills. Sorry, I'll speak louder. Can you hear me now? We have one who cannot hear. Hopefully that is not all of you. There are 3 modes that are reflected. Does anyone know what are those 3 modes? Longwood's typing. Fantastic. Longwood added, and so did Harrisonburg and ODU. Oh, you're all coming in. Interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. So in terms of communication, those three modes you could mark down on your sheet if you did not already know this. They can be interpersonal speaking, when I'm speaking to somebody. They can be interpersonal writing, when I'm writing an email to someone. It can be presentational speaking. Right now, we're doing a little bit of interpersonal, but generally this is presentational. It's a speech or discourse. And you can have presentational writing. Then there is the interpretive mode, which can be either reading, interpreting what you've read, or listening, interpreting what you've heard. Now you have all this handy dandy stuff on your handout, and we can move through the other standards. So as we dig deeper into the Virginia SOLs, we can see that the cultures standard on the national scale drills down into cultural perspectives, practices, and products in the Virginia standards. And with connections, then when we get to comparisons, they're cultural and linguistic comparisons. And finally, communities, communication across communities. I'd like to bring to your attention the fact that these SOLs are currently being revised. There was a group that did meet this summer with the Virginia Department of Education to look at the Virginia state standards, and there will be a very informational session at FLAVA, the conference, the first week in October. So if you're interested in finding out what the proposed changes or revisions to the Virginia SOLs would be, I think that it would be really useful to attend that. So far, we've spoken a little bit about the objectives, and hopefully I've hit this one, that now you would be able to, if you hadn't already, be able to identify the standards, the skills, and modes of communication. Okay, moving on. So let's say you have a student who's really, really good at presentational speaking. Does that mean that that student is an excellent listener? Or if they can read in the target language, does that mean that they necessarily write well? Well, all of us seem to recognize that that's not really true. So when you're talking about your grades, and that's your primary way that you're communicating to the students, certainly, how well they're doing at what they need to do to improve, what are you telling them if you're telling them they're good at homework, or they're good at a test, or they're poor at quizzes? They don't glean a lot from the information that you give them, and yet what they really would like to know is how well are they doing with regard to the standards, and especially with regards to those that deal with communication. Because your student came to your classroom to learn how to say something. And I'm getting caught on my PowerPoint. Okay, so this is a moment where you will be reflecting, and it will be guided by the handout. What do grades measure? That's one thing that we really need to think about. This is not quite a think, pair, share. What I'd rather have you do is think and write down on this handout what you think grades measure. We're having a little glitch here. There we go. For whose benefit are these grades? And then finally, how are they used? And then when you're done just writing that out, I'd like you to talk about it in groups of 2 or 4, depending on the size of your meeting group, and then share some of this with your facilitator, as we'll do here. And as I'd say in about 2-3 minutes, I'll check back with everybody and see how everyone is doing. So your facilitator will be typing out the responses of your groups. Go ahead. I'll put us on mute so we don't disturb you. I love the responses that I'm getting. I don't mean to cut in on your conversation time. Once I get a large number of responses, what I'll do is I'll read out the responses for all of those of you that cannot see them all. Grades, what do they measure? I see they measure performance and proficiency. They benefit everyone involved. So those stakeholders are students, teachers, parents, and they're used for progress and success. And now they're used for teacher performance. That's absolutely true. This does tie in with the new evaluation instrument. The grades measure the ability to use the target language in various modes. And grades sometimes measure work habits or responsibility as well. That's an interesting point that we'll touch on later in terms of, are we teaching citizenship or are we just teaching the world language that we're focusing on? And for whose benefit? They are for the benefit of all these parties, these stakeholders. Another added, it's for comprehension of reading, proficiency of speaking and writing. So back, we're talking about, it's about the standards. It's measuring the standards or how the student is measured against a particular criteria, maybe the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. They measure progress and understanding, effort, another citizenship item here, comprehension, knowledge of culture, that's important too, that's one of the standards. They're for the benefit of students, parents, and teachers, and that's especially true in a K-12 environment. When you're talking about a community college, a college, or a university, it's generally for the benefit of the administrators and then the teacher and the student. I love this one. It says, what do they measure and what should they measure are often not the same. Yes. And I think that at the end of our discussion today, we may come to a consensus of what we believe they should measure. Grades measure the progress of functionality in a language. They're used to see the progress and see if the students are prepared to move to the next level. So they have a lot to do with articulation. So they may be a gatekeeper between one level of a language and another level of a language. And if it's based on seat time, like level 1, level 2, or if it's based on proficiency guidelines, like a novice class, novice mid class, novice high, that may determine whether the student moves up or not, or remains in that particular course. They're used to modify instruction, right? Grades or assessments can be used to drive our instruction. They measure improvement, and on a practical level, they measure where the student is compared to his peers. Yes, that's very interesting. That's between something that's like criterion referenced and something that's norm referenced, because some teachers use it, their grading system is, let's say, on a bell curve, so that would be in relation to the other students in that particular class and that particular year and that particular course, whereas others are criterion referenced, and so that's against an unmoving target like the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Wow, you all have done your homework. I think that we've hit most of the things that I wanted you to think about on your own. Some people do use grades not only to convey these things that we've spoken about, but also to punish students. So let's say a homework grade, if it's really heavily weighted, might punish a student who hasn't done their homework, but who actually is functional or proficient in a language. So I like that you're thinking about using grades to inform the stakeholders, and I like that you're thinking about using it to improve planning and your instruction. And we're going to move on. If I can press the little button here. Yes, grades can also measure how well we, the educators, are teaching the material. So it's my belief system that your grades are the primary mode of communication between you and the world. So in a K through 12 environment, that's going to be all those stakeholders. So it's administrators, teachers, students, maybe your peers, your department chair, parents, and maybe the larger community. Spazzing out again. I think that when we take turns pressing the mouse, sometimes this happens. So this is a traditional grading system. I'm going to divide it into homework, class participation, quizzes, tests, final. It's pretty typical. I think a lot of your school districts that you work in may require you to have a certain percentage of homework, maybe 5 or 10%. Others may require you to have a final exam in there. They may provide that common assessment, or you may have to provide it or create it yourself. But some of these things you do not have a lot of autonomy. So some of the things I'll be raising today, you may not be able to change. But within what you can change, I'd like for you to think about the question of what does this traditional grading system do? And this may or may not be the grading scheme that you use. So now is a true think, pair, share, where I'd like you to turn to a shoulder partner or to another group of colleagues and think about this question. How does a traditional grading system, whether it's yours or you're not using a traditional one now, inform you and your students about their growth toward proficiency? So again, 2 minutes talking alone. I'll mute here, and then your facilitator will mark and tap out all that you have decided you wish to share. Thanks. I'm imagining you all are having very rich conversations because no one has typed anything in yet. I see that Virginia Beach and Longwood are in a fight to come through. Longwood states the traditional system can hide the various modes and skills that might actually be assessed. For instance, a test grade might be the combination of a listening section, a writing section, and a reading section. Bravo. I think you're all coming to a realization that it took me a long time to reach. Which is, I was grading the way I was taught in school. And I want to free you all up to the extent that your college, university, or school district permits you to consider maybe a skills-based. I see that in Yorktown, they're talking about a skills-based system. It might be tricky to get enough assessments every quarter in to make it fair. And one way to handle that, that's right, is to use a point-based system. Also, as Virginia Beach weighs in, they say, you know, if a teacher assesses using a matching or a fill in the blank or a Scantron, or a teacher assesses using a performance-based assessment that is more easily parsed into skills and modes, that may affect whether you can institute a skills-based grading system. I agree. All components should be included: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Because essentially, if we think back to one of the original slides, it's that some students may be skilled at something like interpersonal speaking, but not at interpretive listening. Or they may be really skilled at presentational writing, but not so much on interpretive reading. So you would ideally, if this is your primary form of communication with all of your stakeholders, you would wish to convey where the student is, that particular performance, and also where they're going in terms of proficiency. And you would want the student to recognize that as well, because that would benefit them in terms of learning how to self-regulate, which is a 21st century skill, metacognition, thinking about thinking, ties in with all the learning style inventories our students are being asked to complete. So I am going to read a lot of these because I think that this is a really robust discussion here. Some of the groups are saying that, I zipped past them. We have come to the conclusion that just a multiple choice based test is not a true test of complete skills and knowledge. Right. And I like that you use the word knowledge too, because that's something I want to draw us back to later, which is conversing in another language is not only a function of knowledge. So there are other things that we would wish to assess and also communicate. Rubrics are important when you're balancing the 4 skills, especially since speaking and writing generally have to be graded on a rubric. And so when you're talking about a grading system, you also have to be thinking about the quality of the rubric you're using, whether that rubric has been communicated adequately to the stakeholders in advance of the assessment. So, for example, using an ACTFL proficiency-based rubric, maybe something derived from the Fairfax County rubric, might be really helpful, and then communicated maybe via your web page or your wiki space, or however you convey information, open house, giving out a handout to parents so that they know how their children or students will be assessed in terms of those particular skills. I'm going to draw us to another slide, as there has not been much typing, so I think that we're basically done with that aspect. This is a really important book, A Repair Kit for Grading. It's a new book by Ken O'Connor, and he states a number of things that are considered, in his mind, best practices. And this doesn't just apply to world language teaching. Even though the presentation today is about world languages, this particular book is not about world languages. I want you to think about what he says in this book, and then you may wish to jot down on the handout whether you agree or disagree with any one of these points. Now, there are a number of points. These are really big philosophical issues that are being debated across the country, and you may heartily disagree, but I think that just reflecting on these may really make you consider some changes to your current grading practices. So he says, do not consider student behaviors, attendance, group scores, or academic dishonesty. For example, student behavior, whether they show up late, whether they come prepared, that shouldn't be reflected in the grade book. That there might be other ways that you could communicate your dissatisfaction about this particular lack of citizenship skills. Group scores, he does not like group scores. He thinks that it is unfair when you place students in a group. Now, in my own classroom practice, I was comfortable placing students in groups and giving them specific skills, or tasks to do. And I felt fine giving grades for these assignments. Upon reading A Repair Kit for Grading, I'm wondering whether that was completely wise. In some ways, it teaches students that when they get into the real world, they will have to collaborate with others on projects, and they will have to be graded in the ways that we are graded in the adult world. But perhaps that's not the best way to communicate a student's growth toward proficiency. And he also adds academic dishonesty, meaning there may be a way in your school that you would want to convey dissatisfaction with cheating, for example, that would not be the grade book. Perhaps it might be that they have some other consequence, a detention, or their parents are called, or something administratively. He says, do not include extra credit or zeros, and I know that there have been numerous books and sessions, professional development sessions on including zeros. And he says also, do not include any formative assessments. So that would winnow down the amount of assessments that would be in the grade book. I'm not sure I'm happy with this. I think that if we're going towards skills-based grading in a world languages classroom, the issue that was raised earlier by one of the groups was that you need to have a certain number of grades in the grade book for each marking period, and that by removing formative assessments, we might lose those. No extra credit. Certainly in my classroom practice, I used a lot of extra credit, and I thought it was wise at the time. He says you should not calculate grades using the mean. This is how most of our electronic, digital, online grading systems work. The software that's given to us by our employer for determining the students' grades. And that begs the question, are we sufficiently professional that we can just assign a grade without having the exact mathematical formula of how we got there? So there are some things he suggests we do. We should include students in the grading process. So that would mean you'd have to reflect upon, are you teaching third graders? Are you teaching seventh graders? How much a part of the process is it? Perhaps maybe for one project, you include students in creating a rubric for that particular project. You might not have to include them in every aspect of your grading system. Express clear expectations So that includes providing them with whatever rubric you're using to grade them. Report the evidence by standards. So for us, those standards, the national and the SOLs, that would mean moving towards a standards-based grading system, which is very similar in world languages to a skills-based grading system. And then he advocates determining grades using the median and professional judgment. I'm not sure all of your employers would like you to do that. So you may agree with some of this, or you may disagree. You may think that this is just a bunch of craziness, but this is certainly what's out there. And the people that are writing the books and thinking the thoughts about grading, this is the newest, the cutting edge, I would say, of the conversation. And this is my analogy. And I did not invent it. It came to me by Scott Benedict, whom I'll refer to later. But when you drive a car and the policeman stops you, he does not know whether you took the driving exam 4 times and failed, or you had to, be taught by your mother and then you had to go to driving school. All he knows is that you have a driver's license. So if we think about grades in that way, if the end of course examination, your summative assessment, shows that that student is proficient in the language you're teaching, so you can check off, level 1, they've hit novice high in all 4 skills, then perhaps that's all you need to know, and that's all you need to communicate. Something to think about. Now, Scott Benedict, he is known for the Teach for June workshops. June's not a person. June is the end of the year. So you're teaching toward an end, and that end being that your students are proficient. These are the kinds of things that Scott Benedict has been thinking about and doing professional development sessions on. Are grades an indicator of work given versus work completed? So you give your student 10 worksheets and they turn in 5. Or you have 100 questions on your Scantron exam and they got 50 right, so they got a 50%. Think about, what are you communicating with that? So we want to teach the way we assess, and we want to grade the way we teach and assess. So if we're moving toward teaching immersively and guiding students toward proficiency, then we should be assessing them that way, assessing them on their proficiency, and then grading that way. Never consider behavior participation when calculating grades, and that is hard to do because part of what K through 12 teachers are tasked with is teaching certain citizenship skills, like working well with others and showing up on time and having your materials. So if one were to follow the advice of Scott Benedict, one would have to figure out other ways to communicate this important information, whether it's, a written addendum to your grades. You should only assess what a student can do with what they know. So everything else is scaffolding, and I loved reading this because this is more like a university system in which one is assessing summatively what the student can do and not counting up, oh, in September, they did very poorly on a quiz. And that poor grade is going to follow them all the way through to the end of the year. And regardless of whether they can drive that car or ask for the bathroom in Spanish in a full sentence, they still have to carry this poor grade with them. And also it's a doing with what they know. So it's not just the discrete knowledge. They know how to conjugate the verb. They know how to form a question. They know the particular vocabulary, but actually what they're doing with it. So if you're considering now, my grading system is not all that, maybe I can change it a little bit, I think you should think about a few things. For example, if you were to have a fantastic idea, I think that I'll incorporate one thing that I learned at this this FLAVA webinar, and I will allow my students to make up or redo their assignments because I want to catch them being good, doing what they're doing well, and not the errors that they made along the way. But then there are other things that you have to take into consideration. For how long? So, would you leave the grade book open for the entire semester? Are you allowed to? Do you have to check with your department chair? Do you have to check with your assistant principal? For how much credit? So I personally used to, in my classroom practice, I used to leave it open for the entire semester. Scott Benedict would say, that was good. On the other hand, for how much credit? I only gave a half a credit. So if you got something wrong, and it was not a true or false where you could just switch it, well, I said false, so now it's true, but something where they really had to think, how much credit would I give them? I gave them half. Should they have to reflect on why they got it wrong initially and give a justification? If they're in a level 1 or 2, does that justification have to be in the target language or can it be in English? I initially chose this, but it should have been that because. Should it be open or closed book? I used to let my students have all their notes and the book and everything, and invariably they still got everything wrong. So they had the opportunity to come in after school and redo an assessment. And yet, even with all the materials and the resources and the supportive things backing them up, they still couldn't give me the correct answer about half the time. I chose to do it after school. Some people may choose to do it during class, but the point is you cannot just decide that you're going to willy-nilly select something new with grading and not communicate it to the stakeholders and not think about all the different details that go into crafting it to make it really work for you and your students. So now I can't see if you raise your hand. The raising the hand part will alert your facilitator to the different people in the groups that have these different kinds of grading systems. So I would like you in your groups to raise your hand if your grading system values higher order thinking. And I'd like you to explain, if you've raised your hand to the facilitator, explain how does it do that? And I'll give a couple of minutes for that, and I'll watch as your answers come in. Thanks. I'm going to chime in because I'm getting so many great responses here. I see that some people say they reserve the top row of the rubric for answers that include comparisons, analysis, or supporting opinion. I think that's fantastic. Another person added that they have objectives, lesson plans, and activities that are tailored toward higher level thinking. So I don't know if that's necessarily reflected in the grading, but it is definitely reflected in the instruction. Certainly it's something that our employers want to see more of. There was a question too about what do they mean by using the median, and I'm sorry, by making the PowerPoint larger, we lost a little bit of the thread of the conversation. So by the median, in terms of, you know, mathematically figuring the grades, do you want to just look at the grades like they're mostly A's and sometimes C's, and then graded kind of holistically, or are you just adding up every single item and doing it mathematically or arithmetically? I hope that answers that. So I'm going to scroll down. Not all grades are reflecting higher order thinking, yeah, and not all of them can or should. So here's another question. How does, and sometimes my PowerPoint doesn't show up perfectly for you with the system we're using, so I'll read it to you. How does it help you identify students who need extra assistance with certain skills? Bedford County weighed in on the higher order thinking. I like that no yes or no answers or true or false are required. So anything that's really open-ended tends toward higher order thinking. Yes, so I love this answer. Assessing skills provides us with the data for differentiation. Right, so we can differentiate who is doing well in certain skills if we are assessing and grading that way. But for example, if we go back, if we're doing tests and the component in the grade book is tests, then one wouldn't know whether that student was doing particularly well in speaking or writing or reading. So differentiation can be on a case-by-case basis per assessment, as Bedford County noted. But in general, a traditional grading system would not provide you with a way to identify which students needed assistance. That's interesting. Differentiation can also be part of the assessment, built in. Yes, it can. If we're talking about an assessment too that is creating a product, you can differentiate by allowing the students to select which product they wish to do, let's say movie maker or some other, or Animoto or whatever, or we can assign them. Some of the students we may assign the same exact product, but we might, let's say, have them do a travel brochure in the target language, but for the student that's struggling, we might assign to them one person that wishes to go on vacation, and for the student that is very adept in the language, we might assign to them a family with 2 kids and a dog and a grandmother, and somebody has a gluten allergy, and where would they go to a restaurant, and somebody's handicapped, so they need to get a special pass. And so that student could also be doing the same exact assessment in a slightly different way. I'm going to go on to the next and final of these questions about your current grading system, which is Does the system you have in place right now at the beginning of the year help you identify the students that would benefit from enrichment so that you could provide it either separately, or you could group them in terms of that, or you could differentiate their assessment based on your knowledge of their skills? Harrisonburg weighs in addition to thinking about needing skills with certain skills, we need to capture and give feedback on modes too, interpersonal versus presentational. And I agree absolutely. But when we think about what our students enter our rooms, the beginning students, what they want is they don't just want knowledge. They don't just want the word for restaurant or toilet. They want to be able to go to a foreign country and ask for a toilet and find it, and ask for a particular restaurant. And what they're doing is generally interpersonal. So I find that a lot of our assessments, because of our needs in terms of ease of grading, we tend toward presentational speaking and presentational writing. I'm not sure whether that conveys to the student how well they're doing interpersonally. And that's exactly what they came for. Okay. I'm going to move on. I think that you've spent enough time thinking about how you currently grade, and we can move on to perhaps skills-based grading. And this would be a grading system that parses out the grades by skill. Generally, a skills-based grading system would be 25, 25, 25, 25, unless one wanted to also include things like class participation, or might want to include culture, other things that are important in our standards. You could do a grade book where it says quizzes, and then in parenthesis, listening, or test, parenthesis, listening portion of test. So I wonder, is this the answer? Is skills-based grading the complete answer? But when I look at this, I see that it would help a student determine if they're particularly good, strong, or weak in one of the skills, maybe not with the modes, because it's not parsed out that way. But it doesn't necessarily tell me whether their higher order thinking is a big part of what they're doing and what they're being assessed on. I'm not sure this makes sense, but as we go through, it may make more sense. So I would advocate proficiency-based grading, which is standards-based grading. It's centered on the ACTFL standards and our SOLs. And it is skills-based because it shows what the students know and can do. So for example, they may know the numbers from 1 to 100, and what they can do with it is they can ask and answer age, or ask and answer telephone numbers, or whatever it is you want them to do with that. And it may identify an area of strength and weakness if the student has that, so that you could diagnose, could look at a student's grades, and you could diagnose that they needed perhaps some extra help in reading, for example, so that when you met with the parents in the parent-teacher conference, you could have the grade book with you, or a printout of it, and you could say, this is exactly where Juanita needs to work. You could also use it to drive the kinds of things that you might provide the student in terms of enrichment or remediation after school, or use it to group the students in homogeneous or heterogeneous groups. So I believe that a proficiency-based grading system is the best way to grade for proficiency. And it is based on Bloom's taxonomy, which we've all learned about. What we're doing is we're moving toward rigor. And we're also presuming that all students, whether they're special ed students or students that have not had success before in a language classroom or in any kind of classroom, are open and capable of having success in our classroom and of thinking about how they think and how they progress, how they get better at doing what they need to do in that language. So we want to value what we want them to do. And what we want them to do is to create with language. Once again, going back to what I said, we don't just want them to know vocabulary and the structures or grammar rather that support the vocabulary. What we want them to do is to create that sentence or that paragraph, spoken or written. And as you can see, this is the new Bloom's. And so if you learned Bloom's back in the day when I did, it looked very different. And here's an explanation of what happened with the Bloom's. It was broken down like nouns, and now it's verbs. So it's more action-oriented. And synthesis or creating is now at the apex. Essentially, it's the same thing. So this is a proficiency-based grading system that I would advocate. As you can see, remembering or discrete knowledge is not as heavily weighted as creating with the language. I believe this PowerPoint will be posted for all of you to see. So you don't need to jot everything down, but the handout is there for you if you'd like. I also will be providing you with specific proposed parameters, as I said before, that you can pick and choose from. Well, Nancy, that's a very good question. In terms of IPAs or integrated performance tasks, that may be difficult to parse out. When I was using this sort of grading system, I found that I had to enter grades often more times than I would have had to otherwise. For example, if I gave a test that tested all 4 skills, then I had to enter the grade under writing, reading, speaking, and listening. And that was 3 more times than I had had to before. On the other hand, I felt like it was worth the effort for me in terms of what it conveyed to me and what it conveyed to my students and the other administrators and the parents and all the other stakeholders. Yes, you can give narrative feedback, very specific, detailed feedback to students that is not reflected in the grade book. However, I really think, once again, as I said before, the gradebook is our primary mode of communication with many of these stakeholders. They certainly don't look at the essay your student turned in with your fine notes on it. Maybe your student did, or maybe they crumpled it up and threw it out. But they're certainly looking at those grades. And when you have something like a project, let's say you have your students do a project, and there may be a cultural element, and there may be a speaking element, and there may be a writing. You would have to determine how much of each of those particular categories would be. I'm awaiting Harrisonburg. Never mind. I'm going to walk you through a particular, more than one teacher's choice of how to integrate this in their grade book. In the division where I work, I recommend proficiency-based grading, but if teachers prefer to leave it traditionally, or to do just skills-based, or to do some sort of hybrid, I'm fine with that. Okay. I just don't want to miss out on any of your wonderful conversations. Okay. Bedford says the grading systems we have to use are not user-friendly to these breakdowns. I'm sorry to hear that. So I am going to show you some teachers' grade books, so maybe you can understand how they did it and think maybe how you could tweak what you already have. So I think it's very important to respect the professionalism of every teacher. We have differences in how we instruct, and we have differences in how we grade, and our classes are very different. Even if we move between one school and another school, our students may be very, very different demographically. You can't really read this particular one, so I did copy it so that I could read it out loud to you. It would be easier if you had, this is what one teacher did. And the teacher divided it into knowledge, comprehension, and creating with the language, or application synthesis. But the teacher integrated things that she was already doing. So the evidence she was using, that she was inserting in there, it wasn't like she was creating new things. So she had used an Edmodo discussion board in the target language. And this was, I believe, for levels 3 and 4. So it was slightly higher levels, but it could be done, I would say, midway through the semester of first year in most languages. But for those who do not use a Roman alphabet, I think that there would be a lag time if it were Japanese or Russian or Mandarin Chinese. But anyway, this teacher included an Edmodo discussion board. What else? She included Linguafolio. Now she placed Linguafolio under culture, because Linguafolio, as you may know, can be filled out in English about certain, well, one of the parts of Linguafolio certainly can be about ways in which you've interfaced with other cultures. So you may have traveled somewhere, or you may have had an exchange student in your home, or you may have gone to a Chinese restaurant, and it may have to do with languages and cultures that are not the focus of the world language you're taking. So for example, you're taking Spanish, but you may have traveled to the Netherlands and gone to a Chinese restaurant. You may include that in Linguafolio, but it's still a very positive activity, and it builds metacognition and self-regulation. So you would want to do that, and you would want to value it in the grade book. So this is how one of the teachers, she incorporated what she thought about grading using the same sorts of evidence she had been using previously, but just calling it something else. Okay, this is a different teacher, and he uses more of a skills-based grading system. And he allowed me to have a snapshot, a screenshot of his grades from the previous year. So he valued culture and connections. He also valued homework. But then he broke it down into skills on top of that. As you note, all of the skills are equally weighted at 20%. However, that's not necessarily what I had done or what I would like, but he listened to what I had to say, and we had a very frank discussion. He said, this works for me and my students. And he is a professional, and this is how he expressed and you can't read that, but I mean, he used his grade book to communicate to the stakeholders what he was intending to do. And I think that would be particularly important if you were to change your grading system midstream. So for example, we've already started our school year. If you were to change things, you might wish to change a few things now and then wait till second semester to change more things. But no matter when you choose to change it, you would have to communicate that very clearly and be open to listening to parents if they have a lot of questions, if they've never seen something like this before. Let's see if any of the facilitators have added any commentary. I don't want to miss out on your questions. So that is the grade book, the particular grade book of that teacher that we just saw who communicated his essentially a skills-based grading system. And he did it with colors. So he could follow each strand, each category down and see where the student was. And this is what he could use to diagnose where their strengths and weaknesses are, and what he could do to remediate, to reteach, to group, or to enrich the particular students. Does anyone have any questions about this aspect? Okay, at this time, I would like the facilitators to hand out the grading parameters. They look like this. We'll be going over them. We'll start with the modern languages. So I'll give you all 2 minutes or so to move around, get those parameters, take a look at them, and then we'll reconvene. Thanks. I'm going to presume that everybody has received the grading parameters. Am I correct? Thank you. So I've projected up here what you're looking at, and I think it may generate a lot of questions. And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have before we move on to the classical ones, which are, they may not be applicable to many of you, but they are slightly different. The evidence that is listed on the right is not anything but representative. I have a little disclaimer on the bottom. I see you have questions. I just read the best thing of my day. Feeling inspired in Blacksburg. Yay! It looks like in Spotsylvania, they're having a discussion about the first 30%. It looks like the old system. Yes. And that's probably a good way to drag some of your colleagues in, because you can explain to them, look, you still have the stuff you were doing. And especially in the beginning few months of language learning, I think that a lot of it may be very knowledge-based, learning discrete words. In Longwood, they have a question about, it's not quite proficiency-based. How can we incorporate proficiency levels? Well, the way I would incorporate proficiency levels would be through my rubrics. So the rubrics that I would be using for the speaking and the writing in the creating portion, they would be tied to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Does that answer your question in Longwood? There is also concern that since one has to incorporate a grade in each category, it might require a lot of grades. But I would posit that there are many things that you are doing in the classroom, and this would be if we ignore that stricture against formative assessments being graded. But there are many things that I believe you're already doing that you could include in the grade book. Many of the tasks that you're doing, yes, that they are formative, but they may be speaking tasks where students are just speaking to one another. And you can begin by just giving them a small, especially if you add this in with a point system, which can get a little complex, but I think works very well. Then you can assign a small amount of points, still have a grade in there for something that they're doing as they're taking those tiny steps along the way, and maybe just conversing with a shoulder partner. And you're grading them on the fact that they've completed the task, not how accurately they have completed the task. King George agrees with Blacksburg. Your listing of all the examples of possible evidence is very helpful in wrapping our brains around new possibilities. I'm pleased. And I went to a lot of trouble to pick ones, and yet every time I meet new teachers, they give me new and great ideas of other things that should be included, like the Edmodo discussion boards. Bedford added that culture should have more value than 5%. And I agree, especially with the final part of what Bedford said is, what I really want to do is I want to give level 1 students in the high school setting, or elementary, middle, high, not in a college setting. I want to give them the skills and kind of the framework in which to be successful in an AP exam. So that means drilling those themes down all the way to level 1 and drilling down the way that the students are assessed to level 1. So yeah, that does become a little problematic with the culture being embedded in the literature and in the music. So that may be something that may not be adequately expressed with just 5%, and you may wish to increase it. Or I think alternatively, what you can do is you can parse out the elements of culture that are in some of the things that your students have created or interpreted, and also add a grade in. It would be only 5% of the total, but it still would like heavily weight in the culture section, in that there would be a lot of high grades in that section. I hope that makes sense. And I hope you notice I talk with my hands. Okay, so Longwood is saying it makes sense. Okay. Longwood's typing. When Longwood's done typing and we finish up with this, I will go over any questions you may have with the classical. Longwood, you could reflect culture in the rubric, in the creative sections. Oh, I love that. I love that. Thank you. Because every moment that I'm with teachers who are in the classroom at any level and they share with me what's important to them, that changes how I feel about this. And that's why I have revised these grading parameters about 3 or 4 times since I initially created them. And I created them in collaboration with other teachers in Norfolk Public Schools and with one of the best supervisors I've ever had, Lisa Harris, who's now at the Virginia Department of Education. She felt very strongly about proficiency-based grading as well. And so these are conversations we've been having for a long time, for a longer time than many of you have had these conversations. This may be your first. So if we take a look at the classical, I'm disappointed to tell you that it does not fit Bloom's at all. And I was never a Latin teacher, so, or Greek. You know, I do not know anything about the classical languages specifically. And so I turned to the really knowledgeable classical languages teachers and scholars that I knew. And they feel very strongly, after revising this numerous times, that it needed to be more heavily weighted toward remembering, based on how the AP exam, the new AP exam, Latin exam is, where it goes into Virgil and Caesar, that their end of course assessment in their school division, Virginia Beach City Public Schools, does not assess more really than the translation skills. It's not an immersive Latin situation. There are some classrooms throughout the Commonwealth where the students are interacting interpersonally in the Latin language, but that is not the reality of what is going on in Virginia Beach City Public Schools. And so these grading parameters rather, are reflective of the instruction and the assessment that's going on in those classrooms. And they stated something that I felt like I needed to include, which is culture is a crucial component of the study of Latin and encompasses Roman history, the political development of Rome, the customs and mores of the Romans, and then their relevance to our society and our culture and what the students are thinking about and doing today. And so if you are having students do a substantial amount of writing on these topics, you can include this in writing and in culture. So they could have one essay in English and you could add that grade in both categories. And that way you'd be validating what the student has done, which is think deeply about these issues. Now, does that make sense? I just changed the PowerPoint so it would reflect the parameters that we had been looking at ourselves. Okay, here's the fun part. Now it's your turn. So in light of what you have learned today, think about how you might change your grading system. I don't know that we need 10 minutes. It's a fairly long time, but I would like for you to work alone and then talk to your table partners about it. And then I would like to hear from the facilitators the kinds of changes that you have been contemplating. Can you believe that 10 minutes have elapsed? Well, it looks like some of the changes that some of you are considering making are being more descriptive in categories, considering using the skills in the grade book. Another is reorganizing grading differently to reflect explicitly the implied values. Oh, I like that. Weighing higher order thinking more heavily than other tasks. If that's the one takeaway, I think that's fantastic. Reflect the various modes in the rubrics. Yes, I do use different rubrics for presentational speaking, presentational writing, interpersonal speaking, interpersonal writing. We don't really do much of that, so I don't have a rubric for that. And then we use a modern language rubric, but when there are languages that do not use the Roman alphabet, then I have a Russian specific rubric and a Japanese specific rubric and a Mandarin Chinese specific rubric and an Arabic specific rubric and ASL, of course. I'm awaiting some of your responses. I'm not just staring ahead. Ooh, it's all coming through now. Reflect proficiency skills more clearly in categories, giving more weight to creating, speaking, and writing. I think that's fantastic. Someone at ODU said, I'm excited to incorporate some of these changes into my syllabus. I'm glad to hear that. We've been discussing over here how this affects university teachers because it's often that they're slightly behind some of these, I don't know if you want to call it pedagogical decisions, and tend to be old school in that way, even if they're new school or very modern in terms of their actual content. Let's say the music that they use, the literature they read, that sort of thing. I see that someone is adding to change the participation category with no penalty for behavior. That's very interesting. I like that. Also changing the participation grade to work on citizenship. And so many of the things that we wish to convey to our students and model for them may not be conveyed in the grade book, but as much as we can, I think that is good. I'm still awaiting some responses. I can see when people are typing, so I do not want anyone to feel neglected or left out. It is an awkward format, a webinar. It's interpersonal in a very integrated way. Look, coming back down. Okay, well, I'm not, oh, now I see some typing. I wonder if this is a glitch because it keeps looking like someone is typing, but I'm not receiving anything additional. Oh, you have definitely prompted some conversation here. We will continue on, and that's fantastic. That's exactly what I want to hear. I wish I were a fly on the wall in some of your sites, because it sounds like you've had some really exciting discussions and kind of, like I was saying here, torquing your brain around things you thought were set in stone and they're not. That's good to hear. And so I will leave you with this, the objectives, and I've broken them like sort of like can-do statements. So I hope that I have met the objectives of our session together and that you have, you can identify your standard skills and modes. That would be knowledge, right? That's okay. You have compared, ooh, that's higher order, and analyzed different grading schemes. You've reflected on your own practices, and then you've created. You've incorporated ideas from this session into a new grading system that you may or may not roll out soon. And you've also received something. So you have a copy of the proposed grading parameters for modern and classical languages. And I call them proposed because I do not mandate them. My teachers are professionals and they can choose what they would like to use as their grading system based on the needs of their students, their own needs and comfort level, and what is required of them by their building administrators. But you can always reach me. I'm at jennifer.carson@vbschools.com. And so you can reach out to me, send me emails, and I'd be happy to hear your successes and even about your failures. Because if you've had some difficulties once you've tried to add some aspects of this in your practice, that's something that might be very helpful to me to understand, much as I needed to learn from the Latin teachers about what worked or did not work for them. I see someone's typing. You are very welcome. De rien. Je vous en prie. Thanks for coming out. I really appreciate it. À la prochaine.